Hello, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the dialogue we are going to have today with Professor Wang of the National University of Singapore. Professor Wang is clearly Asia's most distinguished historian. Few can match his understanding of how Asia has evolved and reached where we are today. So today we're going to have a discussion of the topics and themes that we covered in week one of our course on how history is influencing the course of US-China relations. And we're going to spend some time discussing the century of humiliation that we have covered in this course. So Gungwu, welcome to this discussion. And I'm going to begin, as I said, to ask you a question about the century of humiliation, which probably lasted from 1842 to 1949. It was clearly a searing experience for China, and it left deep scars. Indeed, as recently as July 1st, 2017, President Xi Jinping said that the return of Hong Kong marked the end of the Chinese nation's 100 years of shame. And we know that many painful episodes occurred in this century of humiliation: the Opium War, the sacking of the Summer Palace, the defeat by Japan in 1895, the betrayal after World War I on German territories in China. In your view, which of these events scarred China the most and why?
It depends, I suppose, when you're addressing the question and who you're talking about. Because today, when you quote Xi Jinping, it is in the context of US-China tensions and disagreements about various things, and a sense of being threatened by the United States that the Chinese feel. At other times, it is just a general statement. It's not addressed to anybody. Right now, it is addressed very much towards how the Chinese feel about the United States policy towards China. So it has a target. But before that, it was just a general statement. And then you ask how many people actually felt it. Well, that varies a lot, because when it happened in the 1840s, 60s, Summer Palace burning, all the way to the loss to Japan, even to the Boxer uprising and the Boxer indemnity, all
That's
those.
right.
Of course, they were all humiliating, but they were humiliating to the Qing dynasty. For most Chinese who wanted to get rid of the Manchus, this was a good thing. It shows that the Manchus are hopeless. They didn't have the interests of China at heart. They justified the rebellion against the Manchus, that these people should be out. And all those mandarins, Chinese mandarins who collaborated with Manchus, were also to be blamed, because they tried to support a failed enterprise. And so these foreigners showed that the Chinese were backward, hopeless, and were very poor because of poor governance and so on. So in a way, all those events showed that it was time to get rid of the Manchus. So from those people's point of view, they might be humiliating to the Qing dynasty, but it didn't affect the Chinese people in the same way. It's a good thing, because it justified what they were going to do. After the Manchus were overthrown, however, in their efforts to restore a good relationship with the West, to try and get them to, for example, renegotiate the treaties, to take away things like extraterritoriality, all the things which made the Chinese feel inferior, and the way there was racism that was involved, to treat the Chinese as somewhat barbarous and uncivilized. These were things were much more hurtful, because in other words, they continued. After they got rid of the Qing, the West attitude towards the Chinese was, you all want to be taught how to behave, how to modernize yourself, you're so backward. And of course, the Chinese were determined to catch up. They tried to learn their science and the political institutions, international law. They were trying to, but all that time, they were treated like, you just have to learn more, you've got to do better than that. That is really the deep humiliation. Is to be
what
treated.
time was that?
Since from about the First World War. For example, the Treaty of Versailles thing was an openly, internationally perceived humiliation of the Chinese, when the Chinese had actually been allies of the West, when the West defeated the Germans, the German Empire at the time. And yet, when it came to the Treaty of Versailles, they allowed the territory of the Germans had in Shandong to pass over to the Japanese. Now that is real humiliation. Japanese and Chinese were on the same side as the Allies. And yet there, the Japanese were treated as superior to the Chinese. That, of course, you can say that was partly because the Japanese defeated the Chinese. But you can see all these are cumulatively. And depend on who the target was. At that time, the target would have been Britain and France, because they were the ones who were they won the war in Europe and the First World War. So America was not not at all, treated in the same way at all, because America was relatively peaceful in the relations with China. So now, when this is addressed today, it is now targeted at America, because America is now the only country in the world that is treating China as something. They're just not quite. They're not quite civilized. They are tyrannical. Their ruler, their party is evil. All these words that are being used in the languages in Western media and by the Western American politicians and so on. This they're really targeting. Is it deep humiliation? It is hard to evaluate, but it's certainly politically necessary to portray the Americans in that way, because Americans are doing to them what they consider to be totally unacceptable.
I'm glad you mentioned the Japanese and how the territories were returned to Japan instead of China. It's a sort of indication that the Westerners Europeans and Americans treated Japan with greater respect and at that time. And as you know, our mutual friend Ezra Vogel, the Harvard scholar, has said that for centuries China, with its great civilization and stronger societies, had the upper hand vis-a-vis Japan. Yet when Japan woke up to the Western challenge in the Meiji Restoration and reformed itself to become stronger, China didn't pay attention, and as we know, was then humiliated by Japan in the 1895 Sino-Japanese War. Why didn't the Chinese pay attention to the fact that the Japanese were waking up, reforming themselves, becoming stronger? Why weren't they sort of noticing that Japan was going through a great transformation while they were slipping behind?
Well, they probably underestimated the speed at which the Japanese were learning from the West, but they were themselves learning from the West. They were also trying to build a navy. They were also trying to retrain the army, modernize them, buying modern weaponry from the West and so on. They didn't expect to lose to the Japanese. But when they lost to Japan in 1894 to 95, frankly, it's a question of the Japanese were more maritime anyway. They were a maritime nation. And learning from Britain, the greatest maritime nation in the world at the time, made them very superior. Whereas the Chinese when they asked the British to help them build a navy, the British turned them down. The British had decided for China to have a strong navy would be a threat to their interests. For Japan to have a strong navy was all right, because Japanese just a small group of little islands, and they chose to train the Japanese, but refused to train the Chinese. So the Chinese had to turn to the French. And frankly, in comparison, the French Navy is nothing like the British Navy. And so, in a way, some people joke about it a little, that the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 was a battle between the British Navy against the French Navy, and the French Navy lost. But that's putting aside that part. The key part is that military power was everything. That the fact that Japanese defeated China, and a few years later defeated Russia, the Russian fleet went out. And what did the British do? They had the Anglo-Japanese alliance. They allied with Japan because they didn't want to keep an eye on Japan. But at the same time, they respected Japanese military and naval power in particular. So the British alliance with Japan raised the Japanese to the same level as the British. They had no alliance with any other Asian nation. The others were all under the empire. So given that thing, the Japanese took upon themselves as being now equal to the West, treated as civilized people, worthy of respect, whereas the Chinese weren't. And in the First World War, the Japanese took the side of the British, who was the allies, and they took the Shandong from the Germans in the course of that. The Chinese joined the allies, but a bit later, but nevertheless, expected at the end of the war to be treated at least the same as Japan, as equals. But in the Treaty of Versailles, they didn't, because the Japanese were allies of the British. The British favored the Japanese, and the Japanese insisted that they took the Germans, the German control over Shandong. They deserved to have it, and to this shock, that's humiliation to the Chinese, that the British accepted that argument and handed it over to the Germans. And that was the first real break. But there was some other early little things, but I won't go into the details. But all that leading up to the fact that the Japanese had destroyed the Chinese tributary system. They took Korea, and by the time they'd already taken, in fact, before that, they'd already taken Taiwan after the First World War, the first war that they lost. They took over Korea. They had entered into Manchuria after defeating the Russians. They actually took over Manchuria, parts of Manchuria, the southern Manchuria. All that was already built, even before the First World War. And then after the First World War, after the Treaty of Versailles, the Japanese pushed further ahead to take over Manchuria as a whole, and eventually created the monarchy of Manchukuo. All that, of course, and the West protesting in the League of Nations, but to no avail. In the end, the Japanese got their way, more or less. And so all that, I think, was genuinely humiliating. And to end all that with the Japanese invasion of China, to actually try to take more and more Chinese territory, and being defeated by the Japanese again and again. Now you can say that all that was a cumulative, really heavy sense of humiliation after that.
You know, this when the Japanese, right, as Ezra Vogel said, traditionally used to look up to the Chinese. Progressively, as the Japanese could see that they were becoming stronger and stronger than the Chinese, defeating them in 1895, as you said, and then taking over more and more of the territory. What were the Japanese attitudes towards the Chinese evolving around that time? Were their perceptions of China changing significantly?
I think there were lots of differences within Japan itself. There were those, of course, the military, of course, who despised the Chinese military as being hopelessly incompetent and backward. And they were right, they were not wrong. For a lot of Japanese scholars, they remained very respectful of Chinese civilization. But among the scholars, they were divided because there was a new generation of post-Meiji scholars who saw the Western standards of modern civilization as far superior to what the traditional Chinese had to offer. So while they respected traditional China, they felt that China had been corrupted, had been completely weakened by having lost many wars. After all, they lost to the Mongols, they lost to the Manchus, to the Japanese. The Chinese people are hopeless. They are just not capable of running themselves. So they began, that group of Japanese scholars too began to look down on the civilization as being really past it. It's really missed the boat, and it's completely rejected. And you had some famous intellectuals in the Meiji Japan who then said, we must turn to the West. Forget about China.
Yukichi Fukuzawa.
Just forget about it. We turn to the West. And of course, when he said that, he was alone. But after that, I think whole generations of those Japanese who studied in the West went along with that. Forget about Chinese civilization. That was all in the past. That may have helped us shape our early centuries of development for Japan. But today, we turn to the West and we become as strong as the West, if not stronger. And then they developed the next generation of Japanese who said that, why should we allow the West to dominate us in Asia? Asia should get together, Asians to get together and kick the West out. Asia for the Asians. So they moved even further. And they wanted the Chinese to join in. And some of the Chinese were tempted by that. So it's not true to say that all Chinese were anti-Japanese. Some Chinese were persuaded by the Japanese that we should all get together in the greater East Asia prosperity sphere. And the Wang and some of his other colleagues actually went along with that. But there was a small defiant group that led by Chiang Kai-shek and so on, that said, and Chiang Kai-shek, because he knew the Japanese very well, he had studied with the Japanese military. He knew that they were not really talking about chasing the West out, chasing the West out so that they can take over. So that is Chiang Kai-shek's understanding. And therefore he said, we cannot allow that. That's not the real story.
Yes.
And so he insisted on fighting to the end.
Yeah.
And that is how they came together with the communists. They
Yeah.
were fighting a civil war,
Yes.
but they decided to put aside their differences
Yeah.
because they said, this is a greater threat to us
That's
in the
right.
long run. And they combined successfully.
Yeah, as you know, Gungwu, this course is focused on U.S.-China relations, and we have to address the question as is what basically was the role of the United States in this century of humiliation that the Chinese talk about. And as you know, until the Boxer Rebellion, the American troops didn't really fight in China. But at the same time, the US insisted on most favored nation treatment and joined the settlements in Shanghai and so on and so forth. So how is the US role regarded by Chinese historians when they look at the century of humiliation? Because at the same time, as you know, the US was also very generous and contributed money for the establishment of Tsinghua University. So how would you characterize Chinese attitude towards the Americans in this century of humiliation?
There were lots of reservations about the United States at the beginning. But eventually, I would say the Chinese decided that learning from America was a way of dealing with the West, because America was willing to at least to teach them in the mission schools, the colleges. Of course, they were also preaching Christianity and generally trying to convert the Chinese, which they didn't particularly like, but they didn't mind that. America provided also some opportunities for them, learning about capitalism, entrepreneurship, all the modern features of economic development. And it was a very successful America. America's transformation, economic transformation at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century was really most impressive. I mean, they are the great economic growth. If you want to look at examples in modern times, America showed that. And the Chinese admired all that. Whereas, of course, for the British and the French, they were polite and so on, but they really treated the Chinese well. They offered nothing to the Chinese, really. Chinese would be absolutely impossible for the Chinese to succeed in Europe, in England or France. But in the United States, it was possible. Even though there were racist troubles every now and then with labor unions and so on, but the rich, successful Americans were quite happy to deal with rich and successful Chinese. They were dealing at the level of capitalist cooperation, collaboration, and so on. And generally, they admired the Americans. The Americans had an open society, relatively free, and not too discriminatory to the Chinese. The Chinese did feel it there, but the Chinese couldn't even get to Britain and France. Whereas the United States, at least they got there, treated not so well, but on the whole, many Chinese benefited from that. And the students, the Americans invited and opened up itself to Chinese students by the thousands, right from the beginning, very early, whereas hardly any Chinese went to Britain or France. Japanese did for the Navy, for naval thing, and again at the military level. But where America was concerned, it was educational, it was cultural, civilizational in a way. And the entrepreneurship that the Americans showed appealed very much to the Chinese. So the Chinese had very mixed feelings, but on the whole, I would say, in balance, the Chinese were very positive about America right up to 1949, up to the Korean War. And then, of course, the government took a different line.
Well, let's end on that positive note. That how Chinese attitudes towards America were quite positive. And then in next week, when we discuss a more contemporary era, we can discuss about the transformation of Chinese attitudes towards the Americans. Thank you very much, Gungwu, for this discussion.